Imagine you're a paleoanthropologist. You spend your life looking for clues about our ancestors. You're used to a story of how our species, Homo sapiens, spread out of Africa. How we met other kinds of humans, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, and how eventually we were the only ones left. For the last 30,000 years or so, we've been the only humans on the planet. That's the standard picture. Now imagine finding a bone, a piece of a skull or a jaw. You get it dated. The results come back. Well, it's from about 14,000 years ago. That's recent. That's after the last ice age was ending. It should belong to a modern human, just like us. But when you look at the bone, it doesn't look modern. It looks old. Really old. It has features you'd expect to see on an ancestor from 100,000 years ago or even older. This isn't a hypothetical. This is a real puzzle. It's the puzzle of the Red Deer Cave people. The story starts in China, in the Yunnan province. Back in 1979, a geologist was surveying a cave near the city of Mengzi. The cave is called Longlin Cave. He found a block of rock with some bones sticking out. They were clearly human, but nobody really studied them for decades. They just sat in a storage room. Then, in 1989, another discovery was made. This one was at a different cave, about 200 miles away, called Maludong. Maludong means Red Deer Cave. Local miners were digging there and found a huge deposit of bones. Most were animal bones, and there were lots of bones from a large, extinct species of red deer. That's how the cave got its name. But mixed in with the deer bones were pieces of at least 3 human skulls, some jaw fragments, and teeth. Again, these bones were put away. It wasn't until the 2000s that a team of scientists, one from China named Ji Schwepping and one from Australia named Darren Kernoway, decided to take a serious look at all of these fossils. They looked at the Longlin bones and the Maludong bones, and they realized they were looking at something very strange. They carefully cleaned the fossils and pieced them together. What they saw was a confusing mix of features. Some parts of the skeletons looked modern. Other parts looked very primitive or archaic. It was a mosaic, a jumble of old and new that didn't fit the established timeline of human evolution. Let's talk about the skulls. The skulls of modern humans have a certain shape. We have a high, rounded brain case, a flat face that's tucked under the front of our skull. We have a pointed chin and a small brow ridge over our eyes. The Red Deer Cave skulls were different. They had a much flatter and more sloping forehead than we do. Their brow ridges were quite prominent, thicker, and more pronounced than you'd see in a modern human. The bones of the skull itself were thick. Their faces were short and flat, but they jutted forward at the bottom in a way ours don't. And their jaws were powerful. They didn't have the pointy, bony chin that is a classic hallmark of Homo sapiens. As their chins were receding, sloping backwards. When the scientists looked inside the skull, at the space where the brain would have been, they saw more strangeness. The frontal lobes of the brain seemed relatively small, more like an ancient human's. But the parietal lobes, which are involved in sensory information, were larger and more modern. Again, this mix of old and new in the same individual. The overall brain size was average for a human, not especially small or large. It was the shape and organization that was odd. Then they looked at a thigh bone, a femur found at Maludong. A femur can tell you a lot about how a person moved. This femur was also strange. It was small and seemed to be built differently than a modern human thigh bone. The shaft was narrow. The neck of the femur, the part that connects to the hip, was long. The scientists who studied it said it looked more like the femur of a very early human, like Homo habilis or early Homo erectus. These are ancestors who lived over 1.5 million years ago. To find a bone like this in a person who lived just 14,000 years ago was shocking. It suggested a way of walking and moving that was different from ours, so you have this collection of bones. Skulls with heavy brows and no chins, brains with an ancient-looking front and a modern-looking back. A leg bone that looks like it belongs to an ancestor 1 million years older. What do you do with that? The first and most important step was to figure out exactly how old these bones were. The team used radiocarbon dating on charcoal that was found in the same layers as the fossils. This is a reliable method for dating organic material from the last 50,000 years or so. The dates came back. The remains from Red Deer Cave were between 14,500 and 13,000 years old. The Longlin Cave fossil was dated to around 11,500 years old. This was the bombshell. To put it in perspective, by 11,500 years ago, humans in the Middle East were starting to experiment with agriculture. People were building permanent settlements. Neanderthals, our closest extinct relatives, had been gone for almost 30,000 years. The world was populated from top to bottom by modern Homo sapiens, and yet, here in a cave in southwest China was a group of people who looked like they had stepped out of a much, much earlier time. They were our contemporaries, but they didn't look like us. This raised a huge question. Who were they? The scientific community exploded with debate. Four main ideas emerged. The first idea was the most dramatic. Maybe these weren't Homo sapiens at all. Maybe they were a new, previously unknown species of human. Kernow, one of the lead researchers, leaned towards this idea initially. It would mean that a separate lineage of humans survived in Asia right up to the dawn of agriculture. It would completely rewrite the story of our recent evolution. It would mean we weren't alone for as long as we thought. If this were true, it would be a stunning discovery, on par with the discovery of the Neanderthals or the Hobbit Homo floresiensis in Indonesia. The second idea was that they were hybrids. We know that modern humans interbred with other archaic humans as they spread across the world. Many people of European and Asian descent carry a small amount of Neanderthal DNA. Many people in Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA. The Denisovans are another group of archaic humans, identified from a finger bone and some teeth in a cave in Siberia. We don't really know what they looked like, but we know they were a distinct group that also interbred with our ancestors. So, maybe the Red Deer Cave people were the result of interbreeding. Maybe they were a mix of modern humans and some other group, perhaps Denisovans. A hybrid population could explain the strange mosaic of features. The modern-looking parts came from their Homo sapiens ancestors, and the archaic-looking parts came from their Denisovan, or some other unknown archaic ancestors. This was a plausible idea, especially given the location in Asia, which was a hotspot for Denisovans. The third idea was a bit more conservative. It suggested that they were indeed Homo sapiens, but they were a very early and isolated population. The theory goes like this. Maybe a group of modern humans left Africa very early, before the main wave of migration that populated the rest of the world. They settled in East Asia and then became cut off from other populations. Over tens of thousands of years of isolation, they kept some of their ancient ancestral features, or perhaps even evolved some unique features of their own due to genetic drift. The mountainous terrain of Yunnan province would be a perfect place for a population to become isolated. So, they were one of us, but they were part of a branch of our family tree that had gone in a slightly different direction. They looked different, but they were still on our team. The fourth idea was the most skeptical. It proposed that the Red Deer Cave people weren't special at all. They were just regular modern humans who happened to be very robust and fell at the extreme end of the normal range of human variation. Some modern human populations have thicker skulls or more prominent brow ridges than others. Perhaps these people were just an example of that. The supporters of this view argued that we were overinterpreting the archaic features. They said that if you look hard enough, you can find these kinds of traits in various modern human populations around the world. They were just an unusual-looking group of Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens nonetheless. The strange-looking femur, they argued, could be the result of a developmental disorder or just an individual anomaly, not a feature of the whole population. For years, the debate raged. Without DNA, it was an argument based on the shape of bones. And arguments about bone shape can go on forever. Different scientists interpret the same bump or groove in different ways. The key to solving the mystery lay hidden in the fossils themselves. They needed to find ancient DNA. But getting DNA from old bones is incredibly difficult. DNA is a fragile molecule. It starts to break down as soon as an organism dies. Heat and humidity are its enemies. The caves in southern China are warm and wet, the worst possible environment for preserving ancient DNA. The team tried for years to extract genetic material from the bones they had. They drilled tiny bits of bone powder and sent them to the world's best lab. The results were always the same failure. The DNA was too degraded. The mystery remained locked in stone. While the debate continued, archaeologists looked to the context of the fossils. What else was in the caves? They found evidence of large hearths, suggesting these people were cooking their food. And they found the bones of the giant red deer, many of them showing signs of being butchered and cooked. This gave the people a name and a story. They were hunters living at the very end of the last ice age. The climate was changing, getting warmer and wetter. The megafauna, the giant mammals of the ice age, were dying out. These people were adapting to a new world, but what they didn't find was also significant. They didn't find any complex art like the cave paintings seen in Europe from the same time. They didn't find sophisticated tools. The stone tools found at the sites were simple. This added another layer to the puzzle. If they were modern humans, why wasn't their culture more complex? It seemed to fit with the idea that they were a holdover population, an archaic group left behind by the march of progress. So the years passed. The Red Deer Cave people remained one of the biggest question marks in human evolution. A strange group of people with old-looking faces who lived surprisingly recently. Were they a new species? Hybrids? Or just an unusual tribe of our own kind? Then in 2022, everything changed. A different team of scientists, this time led by Bing Su at the Kunming Institute of Zoology in China, decided to try again. They focused on a particular skull cap from Maludong. This fossil was cataloged as Milji 1704, but they gave it a name Mengzi Ren, or the Mengzi person. This skull belonged to a female. Using new, incredibly sensitive techniques, they were able to do what was thought to be impossible. They successfully extracted and sequenced a portion of her genome. It wasn't the whole genome, but it was enough. The scientific world held its breath. The DNA would finally provide an answer. And the answer was a surprise, but not in the way many expected. The DNA of Mengzi Ren was unequivocally that of a modern human, Homo sapiens. She was not a new species. She was not a Neanderthal or a Denisovan. She was one of us. But the story didn't end there. The DNA told a more detailed, more nuanced tale. The researchers compared her genome to the genomes of people around the world, both modern and ancient. They found that she was most closely related to present-day people in East Asia. That made sense given where she was found. They also found she had genetic links to some of the first Native Americans. This also makes sense. We know that the ancestors of Native Americans migrated from Asia into the Americas, so finding a shared genetic heritage in an ancient East Asian individual fits the picture. What was interesting was what her DNA didn't have. She didn't seem to have an unusually high amount of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA compared to other people in the region. There was no obvious sign of recent large-scale hybridization that would explain her strange appearance. She was genetically a fully modern human who fit within the known diversity of East Asian populations from that time. So this solves the mystery, right? The Red Deer Cave people were just funny-looking modern humans. Case closed. Well, not exactly. Science is rarely that simple. The DNA result created a new problem. If her genes were those of a modern human, why did her bones look so archaic? How do you reconcile the message from the DNA with the message from the anatomy? This is the new frontier of the Red Deer Cave people debate. The DNA evidence is powerful. It's hard to argue with, but you also can't ignore the bones. The heavy brow ridges, the lack of a chin, the thick skull bones, these are real. They need to be explained. Several possibilities are now being considered. One is that we have underestimated the physical diversity of early Homo sapiens. Maybe our definition of what a modern human skeleton should look like is too narrow. Perhaps it's based too much on European and African fossils. It's possible that early populations in Asia had a much wider range of physical traits than we realized. The features we call archaic might just be regional variations that were common in Asia thousands of years ago, but have since disappeared. In this view, Mengzi Ren and her people weren't primitive throwbacks. They were simply part of the rich tapestry of human diversity that existed at the end of the Ice Age. Another possibility involves the concept of plasticity. This is the idea that the environment can shape how our bodies grow. The food we eat, the stresses we endure, the way we use our bodies, all of these things can affect our skeletons. Maybe the Red Deer Cave people lived a particularly tough lifestyle. Maybe their diet required a lot of heavy chewing, which could have led to the development of robust jaws and skulls. This could explain some of the features, but it's hard to see how it could explain everything, like the shape of the brain case or the very primitive-looking femur. A third idea brings us back to hybridization, but in a more subtle way. The DNA that was sequenced was from the cell's nucleus. It tells us she was Homo sapiens, but maybe her ancestors, generations back, had interbred with an archaic group, like Denisovans. And maybe, just by chance, she and her people inherited a set of genes from these archaic ancestors that happened to control skull and bone development. So their overall genome would look modern, but a few key genes could be creating an ancient-looking body. This is possible. Genetics is complicated. A small number of genes can have a big effect on physical appearance. The amount of Denisovan DNA in her genome might not look unusually high overall, but the specific bits she did have might have been very influential. There's also a simpler, more cautious possibility. The DNA came from one individual, Mengzi Ren. The other fossils at Red Deer Cave and Longlin Cave represent at least 4 other individuals. Is it possible that Mengzi Ren is not representative of the entire group? Could the caves have been used by different populations over time? Maybe Mengzi Ren, the modern human, was buried there, while the other, more archaic-looking bones belong to a different group entirely. This seems less likely, as the fossils seem to be from the same context, but it can't be ruled out. We only have the DNA of one person. Until we can sequence the others, we can't be 100% sure they were all the same. So, where does that leave us? The Red Deer Cave people are no longer a complete mystery. We have a good idea of who they were. They were Homo sapiens, they were our relatives, part of the great human family that spread across the globe. But they have left us with a deeper, more interesting puzzle. They show us that the story of our own species is more complex than we thought. The line between archaic and modern is blurry. Being genetically modern doesn't necessarily mean you have to look modern. And evolution isn't a neat and tidy ladder where every new model is sleek and refined. It's a messy, branching bush with all sorts of strange and wonderful variations. The people of Red Deer Cave were a testament to that. They were a unique experiment in being human. They lived in a world that was changing dramatically at the dawn of our modern era. They survived by hunting and gathering in the mountains of southern China, and they carried in their bones a legacy of a deeper, more ancient human past. They challenge us to rethink our own story. They show us that even 14,000 years ago, a time we thought we understood, there were human populations that could surprise us. They remind us that the skeletons of our ancestors don't always match our expectations, and that there is still so much to learn about the journey that led to us. The Red Deer Cave people may have been modern humans, but they were modern humans with a very old face. In that contradiction, they tell us a profound truth about the complexity and wonder of human evolution. They are not a missing link or a separate species. They are a mirror showing us a version of ourselves that we never knew existed.